just exactly like Jesus' first disciples, you have identified certain ones among us who have gifts. Gifts that meet the moment, you might say. Then you've nominated them to serve in a special way. And then you overwhelmingly affirmed that they're the ones for this season to step up into this new leadership role. Or rather, I might say, this new servant role. The Bible has a special title for these servants that have been nominated and affirmed, and that title is diakonos in Greek, which becomes deacon, as it's transliterated to English. Today, we are celebrating diakonos. Now, as Steve mentioned, there are several of you who have in the past been ordained or commissioned as deacons or as part of the diaconate. And so I would like to just recognize you first. If all of you who've ever been a deacon at Chestnut Grove, would you just stand for a moment, please? Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. And for those of you who are still seated, this is what you're aspiring to. So now I know who we're going to nominate next year. Yeah. People from among us that we identify with special inclinations and gifts to serve. Gifts that God has given us. Gifts that make us come alive when we use them. The Apostle Paul, about 20 years after the episode that Steve just read, he taught the church there are some things you should look for in the kind of person that makes a really good deacon or diakonos. And so Paul wrote to his young protege, Timothy. He says, this is what you need to look for. And you can read this on the screen with me if you like. He said, deacons, likewise, they must be serious, not double-tongued, not indulging in much wine, not greedy for money. They must hold fast to the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. And let them first be tested. And then, if they prove themselves blameless, let them serve as deacons. The women, likewise, must be serious, not slanderers, but temperate, faithful in all things. Let deacons be married only once, and let them manage their children and their household well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves and great boldness in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. So I'm pleased to report to you today that you, Chestnut Grove, have chosen wisely in picking two new candidates from among us, Jeff and Deborah Wolfrey. Jeff and Deborah, would you stand for a moment? I'm going to have you stand a lot more, but we're thankful to you. Each of them currently are married only once and meet all the other qualifications as well. Thank you, guys. Today we're going to get to hear from Deborah and Jeff about how God has accompanied them and how God has equipped them and how God has enlivened them to serve among us and to live out the faith. We're even going to sing their favorite songs, as Tom indicated. We're also going to pray for them, and we're going to make promises together to love each other, to serve each other, all for the greater, in service of the greater task of helping God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. In a word, we are ordaining Deborah, and we're recommissioning Jeff. Quick sidebar, we actually ordained Jeff, I learned, 48 years ago. Yeah, that's way before I was born. Not really. So today we're celebrating in a couple of different ways. But before we do that, before you hear their stories and before we sing their favorite songs, I want to just answer this one question that seems to come up pretty regularly. What do deacons do? What do deacons do? Some folks think they're not qualified. Some folks think that they have high and lofty mysticism that accompanies everything they do. Well, I will tell you, for about 2,000 years, ever since Acts chapter 6 that Steve read, ever since then, the practice of deaconing has been continuously dynamic. The fact is, deacons, they meet the moment. They serve the needs as the needs present themselves. In the first century, as you heard, there were certain groups of people, widows included, who were feeling left out, who were feeling unnoticed. And so the deacons had that as their responsibility. How do we help with that imbalance or that feeling of feeling left out? In the 21st century, those needs may look like that, but they may also look different. In the recent years, you might notice that there's lots and lots of people who are feeling left out or disconnected or overlooked, and they're longing for some sort of meaningful connection, nourishment for their souls, a reconnection with each other and a connection with the God of the universe. So those needs evolve year after year and, frankly, century after century. This year, we're looking at what the needs are among us now. Back in 2024, we began thinking about how can we help our deacons meet this moment. And so we started thinking about how can we even think about deacons differently than just the inherited ways. The inherited ways of being a deacon have a whole bunch of set kind of baggage with it. But what does it look like to do that now? We turned to some great theologians and authors to help us think differently about it. One of those authors was the great writer Frederick Buechner. Frederick Buechner, he, I think, offers some wisdom to not just deacons, but to everybody. He says, wherever your deep gladness meets the world's great needs, that is God's call. And that would be true for all of us. Wherever your deep gladness, you're designed to find deep gladness around some things. And where those intersect with the world's great needs, that's God's call for your life. Also, the great theologian and pastor and dean, Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman. He has an idea that helped us twist the gem even more on how do we think about serving in these kinds of ways. And Howard Thurman says, hey, don't ask what the world needs only. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. Lots of times I recognize Christians and they seem to be committed to a life of drudgery and asceticism and joylessness. And I would say, I think you've missed the boat. I think Christianity is a practice of becoming more and more fully alive. And so what does it look like for you to come alive? That's a question I've asked the deacons. What does it look like for you to come alive? What enlivens you? That's probably a clue to where God has designed you and where God may be calling you to serve in this world. So those are some of the things that are helping us think about what deacons do these days. And so Deborah and Jeff, we'd love to hear from you. How has God equipped you for this moment? How's God continuing to make you alive among us? Thank you in advance for serving.
Good morning. Well, I was reminiscing quite a bit this week over my life, and as Lance mentioned, came to the startling discovery that I was indeed ordained here at Chestnut Grove 48 years ago. And my first reaction was, how is that possible? Did Chestnut Grove ordain preschoolers back in those days? But then I got about halfway through this week at VBS, helping Deb teach 17 fifth graders. And then the harsh reality dawned on me, Jeff, you really are old. But my long journey in faith starts by the very great fortune of being born to Hugh and Marge Wolfrey in a Christian home. I have three sisters, two of whom are here, Christy Barkley and Kim Castine. And my third sister, Demi, lives over on the Eastern Shore. And our first church was in Charlottesville, Cherry Avenue Christian Church. And we were pretty much every Sunday. We were there in Sunday school. I always looked forward to Vacation Bible School growing up. We had Wednesday night prayer meeting, and I heard the gospel basically every week growing up. And the gospel started to, it made sense. It seemed pretty straightforward. I was a sinner. My parents reminded me of that frequently. There was a significant penalty for being in sin, but that Jesus had come to earth and died to pay the debt of sin that I had, and that by accepting him as Lord and Savior, I would avoid that penalty and be able to live with him eternally. So one day I told my folks that I was 7 years old, but I said, I understand and I am ready to make a commitment and be baptized. And Mom said, that's great, but I think you're a little too young. Let's just wait a little bit. And I said, Mom, the pastor has taught us that this is the gospel, and you're accountable once you understand that. So if I get run over by a bus next week before I've come forward and die and go to hell, it's on you. Mom picked up the phone. But about 3 years later, we moved out to the country, out to Earlysville. And that was a culture shock for this city boy at first. First time I climbed into our barn loft, I stuck my head up under a huge wasp nest and got stung 10 times. But I very soon came to love the country life, farm life, and we, after shopping around a little bit for churches, we quickly landed on Chestnut Grove and joined in 1966. And I loved a lot of things about Chestnut Grove back in those days, especially Royal Ambassadors. I loved RAs. We met weekly. I got a lot of my early equipping in those meetings, learned about camping and being able to actually fix your own somewhat edible food. Had great counselors, including Wayne Sullivan, Billy Garrison, Duck Huff, and others that worked with us. So that was a big part of my early life back in those days. And continue to grow in my faith over those years. And then finally in 1977, I was ordained. I was halfway through my undergrad work at UVA and served here through my med school years at Virginia. And then we moved out to Phoenix to do my residency. Landed in a great Baptist church there and worked there, taught Bible study. And then that was just a 3-year stint, and we came back, and I served for 5 years here in Earlysville again, set up my practice at what was then Earlysville Family Health Center, just down the road. And then 5 years later, we had an opportunity to go back to Phoenix, and I thought it was all about me. I thought, well, God has called me back here, and he's helping me get established in an academic medical career. But shortly after we get back, we find out that the church that we had been at when we were there in Phoenix for those 3 years had been earnestly praying for God to send them a children's minister like Deb Woofrey. So God has an interesting way of humbling us sometimes. But we had 30 great years in Phoenix. Deb was on staff at several churches, so we moved around a little bit. We had the opportunity of starting several new churches, church plants. I served at some of those churches as deacon and one of those churches as an elder. I was also very happy when something happened in the early 90s that was somewhat radical at the time, and that is that churches started having drums and electric guitars as part of the worship team. Now, back in those days, we passed an offering plate around and to collect not only offerings, but you could have comments. You could have comment cards. And in the early days of having praise bands with electric guitars and drums, some of the comments would make you think that we were having satanic rituals at the church. Wasn't that greatly received in the early days. But we had, as I said, a great 30 years. Our daughter, Andrea, met and fell in love and married a missionary kid whose parents were New Tribes missionaries, and he grew up in the Amazon basin. They have 4 great sons and a very close walk with the Lord in Scottsdale, Arizona. One of the real highlights of our time in Phoenix was we got to lead groups on multiple international missions. And several of my residents went on to become medical missionaries. And so we got to lead several trips with them. And I learned something very interesting about mission work. Because initially I was somewhat naive and thought, mission work is, it's all about what you go and do for these people that in the countries that you're visiting. But when I saw the sacrifice involved in spreading the gospel and the sacrifice involved with accepting the gospel in many cultures, it really changed my own faith perspective. And one of the things that was really rewarding was being able to take residents with me, because most of those trips I was able to take residents along. And one in particular, I remember several years later when I ran into him, he came up with a smile on his face and said, "Thanks, Dr. Wolfrey, for ruining my life." Because he had gotten so on fire for missions that he now leads 2 or 3 trips every year to Asia, to Africa, to South America. He's raised probably hundreds of thousands of dollars for missions. So that was really a meaningful part of that time. But Deb and I, as we reflect over our life, we feel like we've really been blessed to live in 2 great places, 2 great base churches in those places. And while it's somewhat challenging to split time, it's also very rewarding, and we're so grateful for the chance we've had the last few years to spend half the year here. When Jesus was telling his apostles in Matthew 25 what it was going to be like when he came back to his, in triumph, and was assessing people from his throne of judgment, that he was going to base his assessment on whether they fed the hungry, whether they provided clothing to the needy, whether they showed hospitality to strangers, even the visitor who parked in your spot this morning. And if I think back on Chestnut Grove, over the years, this church has an excellent record on caring, serving the vulnerable, both within the church family and the greater community. So I'm very much looking forward to kind of coming home and being able to join you in this work. And the last comment I'd just like to make is, do any of you also find it interesting that Tom chose the follow-up song to my comments being, "Is He Worthy?"
Yeah, those that know me well know I'm probably going to need this throughout this whole talk. So in the Bible, I'm always, over and over again, I'm always noticing that God tells us to stop and remember what he's done. He tells the children of Israel over and over again to stop and remember, and he's even put ceremonies in place to help us stop and remember what he's done. So my talk is great things God has done in my life. So, so I'm going to kind of go through my life a little bit. I'll try to do it fast, though. First off, birth. I don't remember much about it, but I my whole life I've probably said I'm really unlucky. But when you really think about it, do you know the statistic that you're sitting there today? 1 in 400 trillion. That you are sitting there. Your person, your soul, the way you look, everything. 1 in 400 trillion. So none of us can say that we're not lucky. We beat the odds big time just in our birth. It's a great thing that God has done for us, is to give us life. And then I'm going to jump, thank goodness, to my salvation story. Age 21. When I was 21, I learned that I had a brain tumor. And at first, I didn't know how serious that was. I met a lot of people who had similar brain tumors, and it was kind of scary because some of their brain tumors were growing, and all kinds of things happened, blindness and all kinds of things. So as I sat in a doctor's office one morning at age 21, I started kind of like a life reflection, and I realized that all the accomplishments of my life were meaningless in the forever. Nobody cares if I'm a cheerleader or if I got A's on papers or whatever I did that was good. Nobody cares about that. Not for eternity. And the only things that really go into eternity are kingdom things, things of God. And so sitting there, as I reflected, I thought, for the rest of my life, whether it be short or long, I want to serve God. And so I gave God my life right there. It wasn't a barter that, oh God, if I live longer, I'll serve you. It wasn't that. It was just like, whether short or long, I'm going to serve God. No, as it turned out, that was over 40 years ago. That tumor didn't grow very, very fast. In fact, I still have it. It sits right on my pituitary gland. It's grown a little bit, not much. And the big problem with it is that it made me unable to have children because it really messed up my hormonal situation because it's right on the master hormonal gland. So I couldn't have kids. So when Jeff and I married, it was with the understanding that I wouldn't have kids. In fact, he said, I don't really want kids. I said, that's good because I can't have them. And lo and behold, about a year and a half after we're married, I feel like I've got another tumor. It's a uterine tumor. So I go in to get checked on this, and before they do the x-rays, they go, oh, let's run a pregnancy test real fast just because you're of that age. I said, okay. But the doctor said I can't, and they go, okay, And the doctor says, would you like to hear your baby's heartbeat? I was 6 months pregnant. So I had only enjoyed a 3-month pregnancy. A lot of you ladies are probably jealous of that. It was a miraculous birth that it wasn't supposed to happen. And so when I was scared to tell Jeff because he said he didn't want kids. And so when I told him, he said, oh, Deb, I lied. I really did want them. I said, oh, that's good. That's good. So our daughter Andrea, and the miracle never repeated itself, even though I kind of wished it would have. If I have to say, oh, sorry, I'll get teary. If I had to combine the very best of Jeff and I, it's our daughter Andrea. She has it all, the very best of both of us, and very few of the worst parts. So part of my coming to the Lord was I started praying like Isaiah did, here I am, send me. Regardless of what the situation was, I was going to volunteer to the point where Jeff sometimes has to say, Deb, you have to give up something before you can do something new. You have to give something up because I volunteer a lot. But that's my prayer. That's my life verse, actually. Here I am, send me. So one of the things that happened to us was the call to Arizona. When I can remember sitting with Jeff as he told me he had this job offer, and I just knew it was God calling. And after he told me the whole thing, I said, we're supposed to go, right? And he goes, yeah, I do. So we both knew instantly that it was a God call, that we go back to Arizona, both changing our location, and for me, my career as well. One of the things that happened as we moved, on the day that we were moving, actually, we were loading a van to go from Virginia to Arizona. And we had rented this little house close to the hospital. And I get a call on this day, and the rental guy says, your house is no longer available. The owner has decided to keep it and not put it on the rent. And I go, hold on. And so I go running out to the moving truck, and I go, stop, put everything back. We don't have a place in Arizona after all. And he said, I'm sorry, ma'am. You tell us in 3 days where you want us to put your stuff. So we had 3 days to find some place. And I started calling my real estate agent right away. He started dodging my phone calls. And so like a day went by, the second day went by, we were no closer. On the second day, this random guy answers the phone at the real estate office, and he says, I'll call you back in 30 minutes after I tell him my sob story. And I probably was sobbing, actually. And and I was thinking, right, yeah, he's really going to call me back. This is just another one of those put-offs. And so he does call me back in 30 minutes. And he said, my wife and I are moving out of our apartment this evening in order to make room for your stuff. We're going to go live with our daughter. And so that's what this man did. This random stranger moved out of his apartment that night for our stuff to come the next day. Isn't God good? And it was a nice, safe, beautiful neighborhood. And when I went by to see the house that we didn't get, our house looked pretty good, but all the other houses in that road had bathtubs and washing machines and broken things out on the front porch. It was a terrible neighborhood. It was close to the hospital, was the only good thing about it. But it was not a safe neighborhood at all for Andrea and I. Andrea was 6 months old. And it was close to a great church that received us. And we only had one car, so there was a young couple right away in the first week that said, we'll come pick you up and install your car seat every single week in our car. And they did for about a year. The other thing that happened when I got there is that I could not get a teaching job. I taught school in here for 10 years. Well, 5 years at that point. I couldn't, well, no, 10 years, because this is the second time now. I couldn't get a teaching job. I couldn't even get a substitute job. Now, all of us know substitute teachers. We die for them, right? It's easy to get a substitute job. Well, I could not get one in Scottsdale until the church called me as a children's minister. Then I got a whole bunch of teaching job offers. But I had accepted the job of being their very first children's minister at that church. Soon after I started seminary, because I realized right away, it actually took a lesson on Samson. You know, it was listed great heroes of the Bible. And I said, Samson? This guy, he wasn't too great. He did a lot of bad things. If you read, go read about Samson, you'll see what I mean. He did a lot of bad things. I was like, I need some theological training here. So I started seminary at that point. And then soon after, I had a pastor come who did not appreciate having women on staff. And so I left that church. But down the road, the closest church to us, actually, a church with no children, called me to be their children's minister. They had no children. And they called me to be their children's minister. God is good, isn't he? Fortunately, I'm happy to tell you that by the time I left there were like 40 or 50 children. So God was good also in sending kids my way. Then in 2000, the year 2000, the North American Mission Board called me to help them with a special focus called Strategic Focus Cities. It was an initiative that they would pour like all kinds of resources on a city, one of the biggest cities of the nation, for a year, and send mission teams by the hundreds. So they asked me to organize the mission teams that came to Phoenix that year and help them connect with a local church and figure out what they could do for the kingdom that would be good for the church and good for the mission team. So that's what I did in the year 2000. I got front row seats to see God do amazing things. It was close to 200 mission teams I placed that year, and it was a fabulous job. Then that was only a year job, and I left the church position in order to do that. But then a Baptist association in the East Valley of the Valley of the Sun is what we call Phoenix and Scottsdale and all the cities there. They called me to design educational programs for their association of 40 churches. And my job was to do whatever the 40 churches needed me to do educationally. So that involved, going to a lot of different churches because I could barely visit all the churches in 1 year's time. But that's what I did, and I very quickly realized, about the same time, God sent me on my very first mission trip. It was to Africa, and I was with a group of 100 Arizonans there in Africa and in Kenya, and we were spreading the gospel. We were just going door to door, sharing. That's what our job was. But halfway through the week, I get a call that our mom has passed away. Well, the problem is, this was like 1 month after 9/11, and we were the very first flight into Kenya after 9/11, and we were in Mombasa, which was a Muslim city at that point. It wasn't very Christian at all. And so with my family, we made the decision that I would not return home and I missed my mom's funeral. If you had told me ever that I would miss my mother's funeral, I would have said, no way would that ever happen. But it did. It happened. But let me tell you how God used it. The day after, I was walking to a village, and I decided not to tell a lot of people because of this, because I cry at the drop of a hat anyway, and I was very tender. And as we were walking up to this village, someone came out and greeted us and said, oh, you can't come because the chief's sister has died. And the pastor I was with said, oh, we're going to come anyway. He's one of my best friends. So tell him that we're coming. So here I am walking up to this village, and I'm tenderhearted about my mom's death. I'm like fussing with God. God, how could you do this to me? I'm barely keeping it together as it is, and here I am going into this village full of grief. The whole village would mourn when something like this happened. So I went into the village and sat down, and we did our usual thing where we each would tell our testimony, and the chief listened politely, but not really very interested. And then I felt God telling me to tell him that my mother had died. That's the last thing I wanted to do because I didn't want to cry in front of him. But it was very strong urging that also tell the chief that my mother had just passed away, that I also had a death in my family. So I told him. And he said, your mother died? And I said, yes. And he said, why are you not going back to America to bury her? And I said, well, my family thought it best that I stay here because my mother was a believer, but the people here in Kenya are not. And I can't change anything there other than to share the grief with my family. That's important, but I can't change anything here. But here, I can change and tell people about Jesus, change their life. And the chief said, tell me your testimony again. So I got to tell it to him again, and this time he received Christ. And his whole village, I learned afterwards, he shared, and his whole village came to the Lord. In addition, that Saturday, we had a big celebration. There were like 1,000 people there. And I got called up. I wasn't supposed to be on stage at all. They told none of the Americans were going to be on stage, except for this one lady who sang really well. And so I got called like the pastor that I had was serving with, the local pastor, called me up when it was his turn on the microphone. He calls me up, and he said to me, tell your testimony. Now, I had to say to him, which testimony? Because all week long, he would say, share your testimony, Deb. And I would share it, and then he goes, not that one. It's the one about this. Or not that one. It's the one about this. So I had to say, which testimony? So I got to share. He said, I want you to share about your mom dying. So I said, okay. So I did. And I got to share her testimony to 1,000 people. And that was fabulous. I felt like how great that is when you get to share someone else's story with Jesus. at their death like that. That was just amazing. And the other amazing thing, too, is that God had the very same songs sung at that celebration that we picked up for my mom's funeral. I found out later. The very same songs. So it's like I got to experience her funeral. At the same time she was having her funeral, I was doing this in Arizona. It was amazing. God's good. So that mission trip started me leading mission trips. And I got to do 2 a year. I decided that the most impacting thing that I could do as the education minister is to take people on mission trips because it would change their lives. So I did probably over 20 international mission trips during that time with working with the association. And each one was fabulous. Each one had a major God moment, like the one I just shared. I don't have time to share them all, but maybe I can come over to your house one night and I'll tell you stories, mission trip stories. So about this time, I finally finished my master's degree. It took me 12 years, but I finished it. And then at the end of that, my mentors, I had 4 of them, all encouraged me to get my doctorate. And so I immediately rolled over and started working on my doctorate. And after that, I retired from the association. But then the seminary offered me a job. And so I started teaching seminary students educational classes at the Southern Baptist Seminary. That's in Phoenix. It's a kind of a spinoff of Gateway, if you know the system. So, so recently we retired. I even retired from that job. You have to keep getting jobs and retiring from them, right, Sharon? Yeah. So I retired from that job, and that's at the point where we decided to start this thing of going half the year in Arizona and half the year here. There were 2 things that led to that decision, I think. One was that I had kept my grandsons 3 days a week during their preschool years. And I did that because I wanted to be a primary teacher in their lives. And so they didn't go to nursery school or preschool. They had Nana school instead. And the youngest one had started elementary. And so I figured, okay, they're in school now. They don't really need Nana school anymore. And so maybe I could spend half their year in Virginia. Then the other big thing was my nieces and nephews. Oh, I'm sorry, because I have several of them here today. If you're my niece or nephew, raise your hand and wave for a minute.